Welcome to the Living the International Life podcast, where we discuss all topics from studying, working, and living abroad, and even language learning. And I'm your host, Jazz Cole, president and founder of Multilingual and Philanthropic Incorporated. Let's dive right in. All right, welcome everyone to the Living the International Life podcast, where we talk about everything from living, working, and even studying abroad, and really being able to promote international education. So with that being said, I'm joined by Jared Romey. He's the founder of Speaking Latino with his wife, Diana. And he's also the organizer of the World Language Teacher Summit, which I've also participated in. He is an American, but he's currently located in Spain. And so he's here to basically chat about just that. So thank you so much for your time, Jared.
Hi, Jazz. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, I mean, because I know that I'm familiar with a little bit of your background, having worked with you on the World Language Teacher Summit, but I want to know like a little bit more about your background, how Speaking Latino came to be, and then also even like how you kind of got where you are now in regards to that.
Sure. I don't even know where to start. For the most part, I grew up in a small town in Maryland. From when I was probably 7 years old until I graduated from high school and then went to college. But before that, so the first 5-6 years of my life, I moved around. I was born abroad. I lived in other parts in the U.S. I lived in Taiwan for a year when I was about 5. So, and I still have memories of some of that. So that part was a little bit different. I would say from kind of, typical upbringing. But after about 7 years old, until I went off to college, I lived in, I think it was 2 houses that whole time. So, it was pretty mainstream, normal. I went to college, but that was only 2.5 hours away from the house, and that was in the same state. So it wasn't like, I had this big international exposure. I never did any type of study abroad as a teenager. So I would say, in fact, let's see, from when I was about 7 until almost mid-20s, everything was pretty normal. Got out of school, got a job, worked at the job, switched companies. And, my early to mid-20s are when things started to change for me. I was working in a place that had free language classes, actually. And so I started taking those free language classes. It was 5 days a week. And I did that for about 2 years. And that was, again, I was probably 23, 24 then. So that's really when my language learning journey and my study abroad and living abroad happened after that. So, it's not, I think, at least when I hear about it, I think it's very typical. Okay, you had some exposure in middle school, high school, maybe you did a semester abroad or even just a summer trip in high school and, went from there. But mine was a little bit later, probably, in that respect.
Okay. And so even like thinking about that, because I know that you mentioned that you were in Puerto Rico for a time.
That's much later, but I can run through that real fast. So I'm not going to do the math, but let's say 24, 25, I went back to grad school or I went back to school for a graduate degree. And one of the unique things about my program was that of the 2 years we studied, 8 months of that was abroad. And we also had to learn a language. And so that's when I really began focusing on the language learning. And that was my first real exposure abroad while I was doing that program. And then as soon as I graduated, I moved abroad. So that was 1998. So in 1997, I had 6 months. No, I'm sorry, 8. Is that right? 8 months abroad. I came back to finish my last semester at grad school. And then I moved abroad in 1998, and I spent like 4.5, 5 years in Chile, Argentina, And then I moved to Puerto Rico, where I lived for 10 years. And then I moved back to the US, to Miami, which is kind of a hybrid of the US and Latin America for anybody that's been there. And then after that, I came here to Spain, where I've been here for 2 years.
All right. So like when you were abroad, you say that you lived in Puerto Rico the longest.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm curious because I know that because you mentioned that your wife is also from Puerto Rico.
Yeah, we met there. Yeah, I mean, no surprises there. I was working for a company that transferred me from Chile to Argentina, and then from Argentina to Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, I left the company and I started my own business there in Puerto Rico. And at some point along that way, Deanna and I started dating, and then got married. We got married, and right when we got married, we basically moved to Miami right when we got married.
Okay. Yeah, because when you mentioned that you had started a business, because I know that with starting Speaking Latino, from the website, it was saying that you started it from helping your sister-in-law. Like, where did your strategy come from that, outside of just, with the prep, but, more of a structure?
Yeah, I mean, it was, first I'll say the company that I mentioned that I started in Puerto Rico isn't Speaking Latino. Speaking Latino is another company that I started. So Speaking Latino came about really while we were in Miami already. So my sister-in-law is a French and Spanish teacher, and Deanna and I started Speaking Latino, the website, talking about the Spanish dialects and language, vocabulary, and the differences that happen from moving from one country to another in the Spanish-speaking world. So I published my first book in 2005, and I don't know, at some point after that, started blogging about that. And further along the way, we did more books, continued the blogging on the website, and then Deanna's sister at one point started asking for some materials that she could use in her classrooms. And so Deanna's very creative and very familiar with video and graphic design, video editing and graphic design software. And so she was playing around creating things for her sister. And then at that point, we realized that there were a lot more teachers coming to the website. And so we started doing more with the teachers there.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that starting a blog, because I think that's kind of how my nonprofit started. It was more of like after I graduated, it's like, well, I had this experience because prior to graduating, I had studied in Paris, and I was the only student able to speak French at a proficient level. And when I got out, I was like, well, other people need to have experiences like this, where you can go to another country and like, I actually understand what's going on. I can survive without my language skill, without like my English language skills. And I remember originally it started off as a blog because I was like, how do I help people kind of figure out how to at least become more proficient?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not something I'd planned on doing particularly. It just, I was enjoying talking about the books, talking about, the vocabulary. I mean, it's incredible. And it came from my experience of living, actually, I skipped over, but I was in Mexico for a little bit too. So Mexico to Chile to Argentina to Puerto Rico. And then I was traveling other countries in Latin America as well. And then Spain, of course. And so I had all these comparisons and contrasts with the vocabulary, and even with like the intonation, all the slang, and everything around the languages. And so it was just fun for me to talk about and find out, okay, wait, there's, I don't know, 15 words to say kite. There's, 2 words to say avocado. There's, I don't know, what are some of the others? Pen's another big one. There's, I don't know, 12 ways to say pen, whatever it is. And so it was just fascinating to me. So I was talking about that. I was blogging about that. And then, from there, just expanded into what Speaking Latino is now.
Okay. And then from having moved to all these different places within Latin America, I mean, how did you kind of adjust? Because like when you just said, there's different ways to say things, like how did you kind of get used to the culture shocks? And then there's also like all these people speaking things. It's like, oh, wait, I mean one thing and then you mean something else.
Yeah, it it becomes a learning process in terms of being able to adjust from one place to the next. So now, if I move to a Spanish speaking country, it's going to be I don't know, my fifth or sixth country that I've Spanish speaking country that I've lived in, and probably the, I don't know, 15th or 20th that I visited. And so I'm much more comfortable with the process now. At the beginning, yeah, there were a lot of kind of challenges and problems, and me freaking out about things and worried about it. But I remember there was one time I was transferred from Chile to Argentina. I was already fluent in Spanish. I lived in Chile almost 3 years at that point, and I walked into my assistant's. Walked up to my assistant and I asked for pen and stapler, and of course I used the Chilean words because those were the words I knew, and so she just kind of looked at me with a blank face. And by that point, fortunately, I'd become familiar with, okay, if somebody doesn't understand what I'm saying, it's probably not the right vocabulary. It wasn't at that point. It wasn't that my pronunciation was bad. She didn't understand me. It wasn't one of those things that you go through as a language learner. And so I had to go up to her desk and I just grabbed each thing and I needed and I held it up, like, hey, what's this called? And then she would tell me what that was. And I said, okay, I need one of these, please. Things like that. Very simple, basic day to day necessities. And it's just you go around living life. And if you don't know, you don't understand, you just ask or you say, hey, slow down. Or, people are very accommodating. They often appreciate that you're making the effort to speak the language, that you're even in the country. They appreciate it. You always find some knucklehead that isn't always as nice, but for the most part, everybody is, and they're really fascinated by, how you got there, why you're there, and just talking with you. So you just take advantage of that, and you just be very open and genuine, and you say, hey, I really don't know what this is called. How do you say this? Or, you can talk around it and say, hey, I need this long stick thing that you use to write with. What's that called? Right. And it just happens. Obviously, if you're living there, it makes it so much easier to learn the language and absorb it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I feel like it, especially like when, because like studying abroad was my very first experience out of the country. And I remember, especially like when you learn the way that you learn it is sometimes, it's always different than when you actually go there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like in the beginning, I'm trying to understand what they're saying. And it's like after a certain period of time, you just kind of get used to it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I remember when I was studying Spanish in school when I was, in my teens. I remember this is kind of a strange thing, but I remember, or it's a strange thing to remember, but I remember asking how to say cake, like a birthday cake. And I could never get a straight answer from anybody about how to say cake. Well,
Mhm.
years and years later, I came to realize, there's, I don't know how many different words for it. Cake, bizcocho, torta, tarta. Um, I don't even know. But I think, no, uh, I forget. There's, and then if you get into the types of cakes, that's a whole other thing, right? And so
Mhm.
it, the answer is it depends on the country where you are and the type of cake. And that was one thing that I guess wasn't explained to me when I was studying Spanish that, hey, wait, the language is completely and utterly different. When I was learning it, it was, I think most of the textbooks came from either Mexico or Spain at that point. And so, those were the two angles on the language. There was obviously never a Chilean textbook or an Argentine textbook used in the Spanish teaching. And so you would have no exposure to that, to either one of those dialects, unless your teacher happened to be from one of those countries and wanted to share some of that with you. So it's, it's just a lot of trial and error really is the way that I found that worked. And I mean, that's true with other languages. I've since been exposed to several other languages, and it's the same thing. It's best if you're in the country, hearing it, looking at it, and trying to figure out, okay, what's the difference between this word and this word?
Mhm. And then I know that now, since you, based on where you're at now, where you're currently living in Spain, what went into that decision to move there? Because I know that when, like for me, like I'm single and I have no children, so I'm like, oh, I'm gonna just move and it's just fine. But like when you're moving like with a family, of course, like depending on the age, you have to get them in school. You have to kind of figure out like, integrating them into that culture outside of just, your own bubble. So what was that whole transition like?
I don't know. That's a whole other explanation. What was that like? First off, Deanna was totally on board with moving abroad. So obviously, having your partner loving the idea really helps, of course. She had never lived anywhere other than Puerto Rico and Miami into her 40s, I guess, probably. I don't know if I have to do the math. Late 30s, early 40s. She'd never lived anywhere else. So, for her, it was a completely new experience. She was excited about it. And our kids are really small. It's when we moved here, they were 2.5 and 5.5. So, that has a bunch of challenges. We basically got here on our own, didn't know anybody. But in a lot of respects, it makes it easier because they weren't leaving lifelong friends. They weren't leaving their schools. They weren't leaving any of that. And so in that respect, it was easier. The language transition for us wasn't that difficult. Obviously, Deanna's a native speaker. I'm a fluent speaker. We speak Spanish at home.
Mhm.
Our younger son is definitely bilingual, and he's on his way to being trilingual. And the older one had some challenges with Spanish, but that's disappearing as we're here longer and he's more comfortable with it. So I think, obviously language wise wasn't a big deal. Culture wise, we're in a big city. So there's still a lot of international influence here and exposure here. We're a train ride anywhere we want, a flight anywhere we want. There's direct flights all over the world from here. So that hasn't been that difficult for us. When we first got here, COVID pandemic was still happening. There's still some restrictions. So, that played into a little bit of things at the beginning. But fortunately, we weren't here for some of the stricter things that were happening. And so by the time we got here, life was getting back to normal. And we just, started exploring a new country that way.
Okay. And so like and especially since you mentioned you didn't know anybody, how were you guys able to, build community? Because I know sometimes depending on, obviously, you're going as a family, so it's more of like you all have each other. Because I know
Yeah.
in some situations where it's like not having like a community of people or friends that you can, or ways to create like, outside relations could be sometimes a challenge depending on the person.
Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, I've been through this before. This is my 4th time moving to a place where I knew, well, let's see. When I moved to Chile, there was one person that went with me that I knew. So he was the only person I knew. When I moved to Argentina, I moved with one person who was my boss in the company. So I knew him. And then when I moved to Puerto Rico, I knew nobody at all. So this for me is the 4th time doing it. You'll learn about it and you figure out what you can do to make the community, and you have to be very proactive about it. You can't just show up and expect things to happen. Everybody else has their lives, they have built them, and you're not a part of it. And so you need to be very active in looking for putting yourself out there, getting out there and meeting people, whether it's going to be some type of sports activity or hobby that you have, or just taking language classes, for example. That's a way to meet people. There's so many ways to do it, but you can't just move to a new place and expect everybody to be opening up and,
Mhm.
oh, great, I've been looking for another friend. Here, let me just throw you on the list. No, you need to get out there and spend some time and make an effort at it. Even 2 years in at this point, our community mostly has come from the parents at our kids' school. Some of that's because of time and necessity. Some of that is most of our activities are around what the kids are doing, uh, and their schedules and their lives, and so that's where it comes from for us. But I've started doing more and more activities. Excuse me for. I've started doing more and more activities as well. Exercise and just other things. We have friends come visit us pretty regularly. Family come visit us quite a bit. So it's just a combination of things, really. I mean, the other thing is as you get used to moving around and living in places that aren't your home country, you realize that your friends come and go as well. And so we have friends that just went back to Los Angeles after living 6 or 8 years abroad. We have another friend who's from here, but she lived for 20 years outside of Spain. And she came back 2 years ago and she's leaving again in August. But
Mm.
we have one of our closest friends now in Barcelona. She just moved here in October from Bolivia. So
Oh, okay.
there's a lot of that, and some of my closest friends in the world, they're scattered all over the place now because I met them in Chile, right, or I met them in Argentina or Puerto Rico, and some of them still live in Chile or Argentina or Puerto Rico, but some of them left those countries and now they live back in the U.S. or different places around the world.
So it's kind of like it's like an expat. You just have to kind of get used to making new friends all over again.
Yeah, it honestly, it's like it's a muscle that you exercise. Like I said, I've done it 4 or 5 times, so it's definitely a lot easier for me. It wasn't something I had any experience with at the beginning or knew how to do, and um, I remember freaking out about a few things that were happening that were just kind of stupid little things, but it's just a matter of getting used to a little bit of uncertainty and being comfortable with it, I think.
Okay. And so with running like a business abroad, what mechanisms have you kind of implemented to be efficient? Because I know that with the World Language Teacher Summit is an online event, which I think that also makes it easier. And then, with any other things you have to do in between, like how has it been, doing everything from abroad?
Um, I've been doing it for a long time because I told you I started a company in Puerto Rico in 2005, and from 2010 or 2011 on, I've been running it remotely. So again, it's something I've been doing for 12 years at this point. The biggest challenge for me in Spain right now is probably the time difference because, uh, we're a 6 hour time difference right now with the East Coast of the US and 9 hours with the Pacific. So somebody in California is getting up and starting their day at 9 a.m. And for me, that's already 6 p.m. and the kids are here screaming and yelling. And so if I want to do a call with anybody, that complicates things. But it's just either accept it or you're stuck. There is no other option if you want to be here in our case in Spain. But um, that's kind of the big thing. Otherwise, all the tools are out there now to manage things remotely. That's not a big deal. People are used to it. They're so much more used to it than 2011 and 12 when I started doing it. So uh, it's become very common for everybody. Of course, the pandemic accelerated that for a lot of people. But now people are everybody is very comfortable from all age range, all age ranges. Everybody's comfortable with doing a video call like this.
Yeah, I mean, and then especially like when I think about like when like with the World Language Teacher, which is how we got connected, and being able to gather like a community of teachers.
Mhm.
What was your process in organizing that event initially? Did you expect it to grow in the way that it has?
Uh, no, I definitely did not expect it to grow the way it has. I did know there was a need for it for teachers, and again, this came about, um, you know, talking to my sister-in-law, starting to explore things for teachers, and finding out that, probably, and these are estimated numbers, but 90% of language teachers do not get that. How can I reword this? 90% of language teachers cannot afford either the time or the money to attend an in-person professional development conference. They can't get ongoing training, and sometimes it's because there's no budget. Sometimes it's because they can't get away from home. Whatever it is. Sometimes maybe it's too far for them, but they can't do that. And it just seemed absurd to me that language teachers can't get any professional training. And I came across or stumbled across the idea of these virtual summits or online conferences as a means to do that. And then the other component of it was, it's very expensive. It's very expensive for a teacher to attend an in-person conference. If you have a flight, if you have a hotel, if you have, of course, food, everything around that, you can spend $1,000 or $1,500 just to go to one conference for 3 days. And there are a few conferences that are outside the U.S. For U.S. teachers, and so those can be even more money. And I came across this concept of the online conferences where we can offer free trainings to teachers, and at the same time still make it quality presentations, and something that is much easier for the 90+% of teachers that can't go to the in-person conferences to be able to get the training that they want and need and should have.
Mhm. And even going a little bit further, especially like with running everything abroad, like I'm curious as to like how your taxes work, because I know that since you are a U.S. citizen, like is your business located in the United States, and then with your being there, I'm just curious as to like when you're running it, like how you kind of are able to with like when you're running it from another country, and then also like in terms of like the administrative aspects. I don't want to get into too much detail of that, but I'm
Yeah,
just kind of curious.
there's no easy answer to that. I'll throw out a couple of things that are pretty well known, but again, these are just comments of mine. They're not obviously anything specific to follow. But as a U.S. citizen, you need to file taxes no matter where you are in the world, no matter where you live or reside in the world. That's not common for 95% of the world's population. So that's a unique thing for U.S. citizens. But there are treaties and there's some exemptions and things like that you can use to manage that. And then, of course, if you have some type of corporate entity, a corporation or an LLC or something like that for your business, then you do that as well, and you can manage it that way. But all of that depends so much on your unique situation that it's almost not worth understanding what everybody else is doing because it can be so different.
That is true.
If I would say, what I will say though is, if you're considering that, it's smart to consider. It's smart to talk to a professional, but that shouldn't make the decision for you whether you're going to live abroad or not.
Okay.
You make the decision to live abroad for personal, for cultural reasons, and then anything around taxes and business, you just figure out how to do it so it fits into the lifestyle that you want.
And that makes sense. So, I mean, because for me as a international education advocate, I feel like it's more, especially because a lot of the concerns I get is, oh, like, I'd love to study abroad. I'd love to do this, but, I'm not sure about like visas. Oh, I'm not sure about this administrative process or it's going to be expensive, which honestly, I've discovered that abroad education sometimes can be a little bit more affordable than
A
education
lot
in the
more
US.
affordable. I mean, not
So
even
I'm
a
like,
little bit. It's like the expensive universities here in Spain are probably cheaper than the cheapest universities in the US. I mean, in the US, and I don't even keep touch, but in the US, I mean, you could spend $50,000 a year, uh, to go to
mhm.
college. In Spain, I don't know the numbers real well, but I'd be surprised if it's $10,000 or $12,000 a year. So that's a massive difference, right? And then, of
Yeah.
course, you move into other countries, you move into South America, and there's probably even be more differences. So again, I would say, if you're worried about the visas or anything like that, and those are just, I don't know if you want to call them obstacles, excuses, explanations that are coming up in your head, but all those answers are online. Oh, getting a visa, is it difficult? Well, you can Google that and find out if it's difficult or not. Or you can go through the process and just decide, hey, I'm moving abroad. where's the easiest country for me to get the visa? Or I'm moving abroad to Spain. What do I have to do to get there? And so it depends a lot more on your mindset than anything else, I think.
And I agree. So, because a lot of times, like, especially when when I decided abruptly, I'm going to be an au pair in Germany, I mean, the visa process is what it is. And sometimes I feel like, well, it's like, oh, well, why do I have to have two sets of copies of everything? And then it wasn't until they explained to me, it's like, oh, well, this is going to stay here and this goes
Yeah.
there. It's like more of like just asking questions. And I also feel like it's also how much time you take to prep. Because I feel like, you can't just be like, all right, well, I'm going to go study abroad tomorrow. So, of course, it's going to be stressful because it's like, well, there's a whole lot of things that go into that.
Yeah. I mean, to get our paperwork together for our visa to come to Spain, it took me over a year to get everything together and taken care of. That was during the pandemic, so everybody was working from home, right? So if I needed a marriage certificate, that was somebody, I don't even know what the office was, Office of Statistics or whatever in Puerto Rico. They were working from home, and so everything was much slower, and it took a long time. But you know, I went through the process, I did it, got the visa, and we're here, right? What's the
Mhm.
other option? Not go through the process and just stay where you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. I mean, and especially because like looking at the entire process as a whole, I mean, like I feel like it also depends on like how badly you want to go. Because I remember I was talking to a college
Sure.
student who said, I would love to go to Italy and study, something relating to architecture and interior design because that was what she was studying here. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, why are you not doing that? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, same thing. I mean, yeah, same thing with me. I had in my head I wanted to go abroad for years and years, and then just kind of built the opportunity to do that, and it worked out. And now at this point, I've lived abroad for do the math. I don't know, 15, 17 years of my adult life, right? So for me, it was worth it. I enjoyed it. I enjoy it.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm also like I mean, obviously, since now you're kind of used to it, but from the initial experience, I mean, were there ever any, I don't know, fears or certain concerns you may have had where it's like, oh, I think my experience was like, well, I'm going to a foreign country and my mom fear mongers sometimes. And I'm like, well, what if I get kidnapped? Well, what if, all these like things. But I guess, but from your perspective, when you first were abroad, like what was kind of like your mindset of, for the very first time?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely nervous. I wasn't worried about my physical safety. I
Mhm.
mean, I know if you haven't traveled, then you don't know what other countries are like, or you hear about, shootings or crime or whatever it is. But people outside the US hear that about the US and they're like, oh, why would you ever want to go to Chicago or San Francisco or I
Mhm.
don't know, Miami or Washington, D.C. or New York or whatever? Because they hear the same things, school shootings are all over, what schools aren't safe in the US. And, that's another debate, but they have this idea that you're going to go to school and there's going to be a shooting there, right? Which it isn't the reality in the US. Not every school has a shooting every day. And, not every foreigner living abroad is going to get kidnapped while they're abroad, right?
Mhm.
And so, you make smart decisions about life, right? You decide where you're going to go. Maybe you don't want to go to Niger right now that there's a civil war going on, right? Maybe you go instead to Spain. Maybe you don't want to go to Russia or Ukraine right now. Maybe, you know, parts of Mexico are smart for you to go to and parts aren't, right? You need
Mhm.
to research that and understand it and weigh it. And the thing is, you can go check it out, take a flight down, walk around for 3 or 4 days, go with a friend or two, or if you can hire somebody local, find somebody local. Maybe you know somebody local, or a friend of a friend has a family member that can receive you and show you around for a few days and say, hey, yeah, this is like living in Midtown USA right here. There's nothing
Mhm.
else happening here. And so,
Mhm.
you know, you be smart about it and you understand that, yeah, you're a foreigner and you need to take into account what you're doing and how you manage that. But again, it comes down to managing your fears and working through them. And yeah, the first times I was going abroad, I was scared. First time I went abroad as an adult, I didn't speak Spanish even. And so I was in a Spanish speaking country relying on my friend who spoke Spanish and was with me. But still, it was, walking around. It's not very common for me to be in a country where I don't at least understand enough of the language to communicate. And that first trip was one of those times I couldn't really communicate much, and that was really strange for me. But I still went, and that kind of opened the door for what my life has become because of that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, because I remember, it's funny that you mentioned Mexico, because I remember I went there for the first time for around Day of the Dead weekend. And one of my friends, he actually was my old roommate from college, because he was on exchange at the time. And I was like, yeah, you know what? He's like, yeah, you should come to Mexico. Like, it's like, I live in like Guanajuato, and it's not bad. It's like, just don't go anywhere near the border. And so it was easy for me because my mom was like freaking out. And I'm like, well, Mom, I'm going with someone I know. So, and that makes a big difference too.
Guanajuato is like a small mountain town. There's not,
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty tame. It's safer than 98% of the U.S. probably.
Oh yeah. So, and like I said, I had a really great time, and I ended up going back because a friend of mine from Canada was getting married in Mexico, because she's just like, well, if I'm gonna get married, I want it to be like warm weather.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I will say also that you have to be ready for things that don't maybe happen around your house. I've been in riots and tear gas and the military in the streets, so it happens. But just be smart about it. I wasn't in the middle of the riots running around and throwing stuff at the tanks and everything. I mean, I was locked up at the house, and everything calmed down, and when things were cool. And you listen to locals. Locals are like, yeah, don't go outside with a shirt and a tie on today, because they're gonna think you're some kind of businessman. They're gonna throw rocks at your car. Okay, I won't wear a tie. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Stuff like that. You be smart about it, and enjoy life and how it's different, and appreciate where you're from at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I feel like that's also one of the things why, like, especially as a language teacher, I always emphasize culture just as much as language, because it's that you can learn how to speak the language, but if you don't know how to kind of integrate in a way, it can also sometimes make it a little bit challenging in the beginning, especially like when you are first acculturating to that new space. I mean, for me, it was like when I moved to Germany, I remember asking my host family, which, that was the part of it, was I was living with the family, but it's like, wait, so what are we doing? It's like, oh, so you eat this for breakfast? Like, it's like they take out everything from the refrigerator and they just put bread, with bread, and they put like all this stuff on it.
Yeah, sure. You have to be open to new things. I mean, if you're stuck in your mindset of, okay, I need to have my special K cereal for breakfast every day, then you might not want to go abroad, right? Don't give up your special K cereal. But certainly it helps if you're a lot more open about it. And I said when I moved to several of these countries, I knew one person or nobody. In a sense, that's also a massive advantage, because I had to meet people, or I was going to be alone and by myself, and so that got me into culture a whole lot faster. I mean, there were years in my life where I spoke almost no English, and so obviously that helped with the language, but that also really helped me become more involved in the culture in those places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially because I remember having to figure out what the kids were saying, because I had triplets, and they don't speak English very clear. I mean, they don't speak German very clearly. So, it's like you're just gesturing until later on. It's like, well, now I have some sense of what you're doing and what you're trying to tell me.
Yeah, I've always found that small kids are awesome to speak with, because, if they are speaking, if they're at the age where they're speaking, they don't care about your accent, or they might say, hey man, you talk funny. And you're like, yeah, I do. Isn't that cool? Or, yeah, I talk funny. You're right. Hey, what's this called? right? And they're like, oh, that's a puppy, and so they have no filter of what they would expect somebody to be able to say or do or speak. And so it's oftentimes really easy to speak with kids.
Okay. So, and just as a final question, just to kind of wrap everything up. So, like for our listeners who feel like doing what you're doing is impossible, what do you feel like is something that has made it feasible for you to do it, that you would recommend for someone else?
I would say it's pretty much the same advice for everything that seems impossible for you to do. You just take a tiny step. And so if you're worried about the visa process, Google the visa process today. Make a list of the documents that you need. Go get one document today, get the second one tomorrow, get all the documents. You're not committed to applying for it, but just take those first steps and then, okay, I got all my documents now. Hey, maybe I'll apply for this. And what you'll find is it's a whole lot easier all of a sudden because you've gone through half the process without even worrying about the end. You just worried about finding your birth certificate and, where has that been? I haven't looked at that in 10 years in my house. I At one point, I was born outside the U.S., so my birth certificate was unique. It was issued by the federal government, and my parents forgot I even had it. What I had was a federal government form announcing my birth, and so at one point we were just going through the documents and looking for things, and then we found my birth certificate. And hey, that's great. Okay, so I have this birth certificate we'd forgotten, or they'd forgotten I had, and that was just part of the process of getting the documents together. So that alone was a fun little step in the whole process. And then okay, now I need, in my case, my marriage certificate. I need police report. Okay, how do you get a police report? I need a medical letter or waiver, uh, and all those things. And so, you just get the process going and don't worry necessarily about the end goal. Just worry about what you have to do today to keep moving.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Jared, for your time. I really appreciate it, and hopefully it has helped some of our listeners. And also, just in closing, where can people find more about you as well as Speaking Latino and the World Language Teacher Conference, the World Language Teacher Summit?
Yeah, speakinglatino.com is probably the best place. Also, we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And for the World Language Teacher Summits, it's worldlangteachers.com is the website. And then there's also a group for language teachers on Facebook called the World Language Teacher Lounge.
All right.
Thanks for having me today. Yeah.
Of course. All right.